If you lived in the Western world in March of 2020, you might have noticed that when rumors about an upcoming quarantine started to surface, the first thing a lot of people did was to go to the grocery store and stock up. We were buying meat, we were buying milk, we were buying frozen vegetables, but most of all, we were buying toilet paper. Do you remember the store shelves looking like this for a long time? In other words, when the threat of a lockdown was in the air, the thing we most all feared running out of was toilet paper. And yet today, when you think about it, it's a pretty remarkable thing. For most of human history, after all, toilet paper did not even exist. Humans survived for millennia without it, but we now consider it the thing, the main thing we cannot live without. So how did this happen? Within the span of about 200 years, toilet paper has gone from something that did not exist to something we cannot imagine living without. That's what I want to talk about today. But first, let's take a quick look back at the history of toilet issues. Since the earliest days, our human forebears had to use something to clean up with. Most likely, they used whatever was at hand: leaves, sticks, mosses. If you were lucky enough to live in what is today Alaska, you maybe used some snow. If you lived in Hawaii, maybe coconut, shredded coconut, something like that. We know that ancient Greeks used stones and sticks. The Romans put sponges on sticks and soaked the sponges in salt water and used that to wipe up with. Once you get to areas by the seashore, you could use shells. These were probably more scrapers than anything else. When outhouses and privies came into use, people used whatever was free and unwanted. For colonial Americans, the item of choice was corn cobs. When daily newspapers became common, they used those. In the late 19th century, mail order catalogs like the Sears catalog became very popular. People used that. You could just hang it on a string inside your privy and voila, a free supply of hundreds of pages of absorbent uncoated paper. There's actually a legend that when Sears started to coat its paper in the 1930s to have nice shiny paper to show color photographs, people began to complain to Sears about it. Can you imagine making one of those telephone calls? There's no incentive to use anything other than what is free and unwanted. Why pay for a product that's just going to be thrown into the ground when there's stuff that's free all around? So the whole idea of a commercial product just to wipe yourself, where did that come from? Well, it actually arose just a little bit more than 150 years ago. And it was thanks to a man named Joseph Gaiety. This is one of his earliest products, Gaiety's medicated paper. He launched this in 1857. These were manila sheets, probably soaked in something like an aloe solution, and they were put into a box, sort of interleaved together the way that Kleenex tissue might be today, so you could easily grab one right out of the box. Now, this product, you can see in this advertisement, he's advertising it as medicated paper for the water closet. He's advertising its therapeutic value. He had only modest success, partly because, why pay for something when there's free stuff around? But it was also hard to talk about. Even then, people got squeamish. This is one of Gaiety's competitors, Bromo paper. This one actually says, use this slip as a guide or give it to the person who buys for you. In other words, you could hand it to someone doing your shopping or your grocer or your druggist if you didn't want to actually have to say what you're using it for. The next big leap forward came in 1871 with another New Yorker, a man from Albany named Seth Wheeler. Seth Wheeler actually had hundreds of patents, but for our purposes, the most important one was his ideas about toilet paper. He was the first one we know of to actually put toilet paper on a roll. This is what earned him the title of inventor of toilet paper. He created the toilet paper roll in 1871. 20 years later, in 1891, he invented perforated toilet paper, which made it easy to tear off the sheets that you need. And for the record, this drawing clearly shows that the paper is intended to go over. Unless you look at Wheeler's other patent where it clearly shows it going under, so the debate about that certainly rages on. He called his company APW, short for Albany Perforated Wrapping Paper. The business name didn't even include the word toilet, which was still risque to mention. APW did okay, but it didn't set the world on fire. The credit for popularizing toilet paper on a widespread scale goes to two brothers, Clarence and E. Irving Scott. You probably know the name Scott. The Scotts brought toilet paper to the masses in the 1890s with really good marketing. This particular ad is all about the quantity that you get. It's tightly rolled, unlike other brands. They also did things like offer private labels for druggists to use. So people could just ask for, if you're at the Smith drugstore, ask for Smith tissue. They branded their own tissue as Scott tissue. This is an ad saying, don't ask for toilet paper, ask for Scott tissue. In other words, ask for the brand, but you also don't have to say the words toilet paper. And they really pushed the therapeutic, healthy, even medicinal benefits. This is a 1920s ad saying women are especially susceptible to troubles caused by harsh toilet tissue. In those days, toilet paper actually could be rough. Some of them even had splinters in them. So there was a health benefit to buying a particularly expensive brand of commercial toilet paper. Here's one of my favorite, maybe most frightening ads. This is a doctor's hand picking up scissors. This is often the only relief from toilet tissue issues. In other words, if you don't use our soft toilet paper, you might be going to the doctor for help. What's interesting to me is these are advertisements about the medicinal value. You don't see what we see today, which are furry bears, babies, puppies. There's not that emphasis on softness. The effort to sell toilet paper on the basis of its medical therapeutic value, that did okay. But toilet paper didn't really gain widespread acceptance until a new technology demanded it. By the end of the 1800s, more and more houses were built with indoor, sit-down, flush toilets connected to indoor plumbing systems. You could not toss corn cobs down there without damaging the pipes. Toilet paper ads began saying, your doctor will thank you, and so will your plumber. It was in the late 20s that toilet paper starts to take on a distinctly feminine appeal. You start to see beautiful women and logos that are sort of in a very feminine cursive look. It's all evoking beauty and a ladylike appeal. The genius of this approach is it evokes the elegance and luxury of it without actually having to mention what the paper is going to be used for. This was the primary approach in the 30s, 40s, and even into the 50s when they started to advertise colored toilet paper. Do you remember colored toilet paper? These were very popular, so you could match your toilet paper to your decor, but it was dropped when it was found out that the dyes can be irritating to some. The feminine emphasis, though, remained when ads, starting in the late 40s, started to put mothers with babies. This evokes not just femininity, but gentleness, softness, a baby's tender skin. Eventually, the lady herself was banished, leaving the baby to fend for itself. In other words, advertisements increasingly appealed to our demand for something that is gentle and something that is very, very soft. See if you recognize this advertisement. In 1958, Northern Tissue began running these really darling drawings created by an illustrator named Frances Hook. Her American Beauty illustrations, they started appearing on rolls of Northern tissue in 1959, and Northern sales skyrocketed. People loved them so much, they eventually started selling prints that you could buy and frame and hang up in your house. By the 1970s, people couldn't imagine living without toilet paper. So much so that in December of 1973, Johnny Carson actually set up a crisis. He made a joke about an upcoming shortage of toilet paper. A Republican congressman had mentioned he was a little concerned about the nation's paper supply maybe being stretched. Well, in 1973, there had been an oil crisis. People remembered lining up at the gas pumps to get gas. And these were often people who still had memories of food being rationed in the 1940s during World War II, and gasoline too, not to mention shortages of food in the Great Depression in the 1930s. Well, to Johnny Carson, the idea that there could be a similar shortage on toilet paper made a pretty good joke. To millions of Americans, it did not. The next day, millions of TV viewers went out to their stores and bought up toilet paper. Johnny Carson had to go back on the air a few days later to address it, saying it was a joke, there is no imminent toilet paper shortage. But by then, people were seeing the empty shelves in stores, and the stampede continued for a little while until people realized there was no imminent shortage. It is true, though, that since the 1980s, the emphasis on toilet paper advertising has been on its softness. We've seen advertisements like the very famous Charmin ads about how much you want to hug it, how much you want to squeeze it. Anyone know what I'm leading up to? Do you remember Mr. Whipple? Mr. Whipple was a grocer. He appeared in about 500 commercials for Charmin, where he would roam the stores reprimanding women who started squeezing the Charmin, and then inevitably he'd be caught squeezing it himself. It was very clever and very funny, but do you notice how it uses humor to emphasize how huggably soft the toilet paper is? And it gives you a way to ask for it without having to use those dreaded words, toilet paper. Please don't squeeze the Charmin. Charmin is a shorthand for what you want to buy. Fun trivia, in one 1970s survey, Mr. Whipple was ranked the third most recognized American, behind only former President Richard Nixon and the evangelist Billy Graham. Today, we spend more than $6 billion on toilet paper in the United States. That's more than any other nation in the world. The average American uses more than 100 rolls a year. We cannot imagine living without it. The question is whether toilet paper shortages will ever convince a significant percentage of Americans to switch to alternatives, including things like bidets and hot air blowers that are used in many other countries, including Japan. Will Americans ever give up their beloved toilet paper to adopt other money-saving approaches? Time will tell, but if the history of American toilet paper tells us anything, it's that American corporations have a big financial stake in convincing us to continue using toilet paper. And if there's anything history really shows us, it's that the American advertising world is a very creative and a pretty persuasive force. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you next time.